concept of frequency and its relation to pitch. Frequency, measured in hertz, represents the number of cycles per second of a sound wave. For example, the A4 above middle C has a frequency of 440 hertz. This relationship between frequency and pitch is crucial for understanding musical notes and their placement on the musical scale. Intervals. An interval is the distance between two pitches. When you completed the exercises in part 2, every time you switched to a new note, an interval was formed. Intervals can be classified into several types. Major intervals. These are relatively larger intervals to their minor counterparts that sound stable and are often brighter sounding and tend to have a lot of resonance. Minor intervals are slightly smaller, often sounding sad or somber to Western ears. Other cultures may actually hear these sounds differently. Perfect intervals. These intervals are neither major nor minor, but they are considered perfect due to their consonance and stability. Augmented intervals. Intervals that are one piano key larger than perfect or major intervals are augmented. On the piano keyboard, if you move up by one key, including the black keys, you're potentially making an augmented interval. So if I play C and F, and then I go up to F sharp, I have just made an augmented interval. Now, this is a little bit more complex, and we're going to have to talk about this in more detail, because it's not simply that if you play a major third, C and E, and then you go up to the next key and make it a half step larger, that's not necessarily an augmented interval. It's actually probably C and F, which we would call a perfect fourth. But this is a discussion for later, because depending on how we write it, if we write it as C and E sharp, something you'll learn later, we would call it augmented. So just know right now that augmented intervals take the perfect intervals and they raise them just a little bit. They can also take major intervals and raise them just a little bit. Diminished intervals are intervals that are one piano key smaller. So if we have a major third and we take it down a half step and notate it the correct way, it could potentially be a diminished interval, but this here we probably just call a minor third, stuff that you haven't learned yet. So here, this interval, perfect fifth, if I take it down a half step, it becomes diminished. And diminished and augmented intervals tend to have that clashing sound. On the piano keyboard, if you move down by one key, including the black keys, you are potentially making a diminished interval. But you don't fully understand augmented and diminished unless you are a musician and you know what this means. And we'll explain that in more detail later. The time's not right for it yet. Exploring the nature of pitch. The human ear perceives pitch through the cochlea, an auditory nerve. The cochlea translates sound wave frequencies into nerve impulses that the brain interprets as pitch. Humans have varying abilities to distinguish between different pitches. For many people, this ability can be trained and improved with practice. The problem with viewing pitch as an absolute phenomenon is that it can vary based on culture and the system being used. Different tuning systems, such as equal temperament and just intonation, have been developed throughout history. These systems determine how pitches are spaced within an octave. It's also important to note that different cultures perceive and use pitch in unique ways. For example, microtonal music and non-Western scales offer a rich diversity of pitch usage. In the next session, we'll explore a few of the more common systems of pitch.